My name is Ty Callio. For 3.5 years, I taught basic adult reading and literacy classes at night at a community college in Lowell, Massachusetts. There were 2 tiers. One was for those who were just learning to read as adults, and then many of those students moved on to a higher level comprehension class. Paul McCooney was such a student. In his 40s, he began in Tier 1, learning to read material like Aesop's Fables and The Giving Tree, slowly moving up to what kids sometimes call chapter books. Paul was a reticent working man who sometimes rode a bicycle to class straight from the cracker factory where he worked, still wearing his long gray work vest and stained jeans. During his time in Tier 1, I sensed he'd had a pretty hard life, which was often the case with my adult literacy students. He was born and raised in the States, unlike many of the others in class, but had pretty obviously faced some real disadvantages. He'd indicated on his personal information sheet that he'd only gone to school through 2nd grade. Toward the end of 2019's spring session for Tier 2 folks, I let the students know that it was time for their final project. I had a collection of cheap used books I'd bought over the years, and I laid them all out on a countertop in our classroom with the ceiling bulbs that so badly needed replacing. Each student, of which there were just 7 in Tier 2 at that time, was to choose a book, read it over the course of a few weeks, and to write up a little report on it. Nothing too stressful. The books were theirs to keep. For 15 minutes, they poked through the collection until everyone had something they cottoned to. Paul McCooney had chosen Dracula. Mind you, this was not the unabridged version I'd read in high school, but a somewhat slimmed down edition from something called Essentials for Learning Publications. The language simplified a bit for middle readers. The slightly cartoonish cover font and art depicted men on horseback galloping up a winding road toward the infamous castle, suggesting kids were in for more of a swashbuckling adventure story than anything really scary. The only description on the back cover was for the timeless classic series in general. I congratulated Paul on his choice as he went to sit back down and asked him how much he knew about the story. He didn't know anything at all, he told me quietly, not making eye contact, as usual. He'd never even heard of Dracula. Teaching grown-ups to read had conditioned me to expect and accept that much of what we take for granted in America is the product of our selective blindness toward the less fortunate, so I wasn't completely surprised. He just liked the cover. I told him I hoped he'd dig the story. No spoilers. The next Tuesday night, after the class's weekly vocabulary session, where I took them through words like vigilant, meander, and concoction, I left the small campus at 8:15 and started the walk home to the condo where I lived with my wife. It was very conveniently just a few blocks away, through a nice, leafy neighborhood beside 2 horse farms. Paul was lingering on the sidewalk under a lamppost outside the Sciences building. He was waiting for some kind of anti-flat solution to settle in his bike's front tire. I asked him if he'd started Dracula and if he was liking it. He thought about it for a moment, creasing his brow in an exaggerated way, as he often did in class when he was confused by something. He was a tall, muscular, mostly bald man with fairly wild tufts of hair around his ears. His eyes were a rather vivid gray-green, a bit icy. It turned out he'd barely even cracked the book. He was finding it very scary. "I don't get it," he said. "This guy, Harker, he leaves his wife and goes all the way from Germany to this weird place, Budapest. That's what happens, right?" I nodded, correcting his pronunciation gently. He said he'd looked up how far that was on the map in the classroom down the hall from mine. He was kind of stunned at the concept of a trip taking weeks. One of the wildest and least known parts of Europe, Paul quoted impressively, squeezing his eyes tight in recall. Then he shook his head, unable to fathom it. He offered the opinion that Harker must have been very lonely, going from a city to tall, strange mountains, and worried about what he was seeing and hearing right away. And then, Paul went on, he has all these bad dreams and a dog howling all night outside his window. And then some woman warns him the next day will be some holiday when all the evil things in the world get stronger. Yeah, very eerie, I agreed. Paul closed his eyes again and shook his head rapidly in the dark, as if upset a little that I should interrupt his train of thought. She begs him to not go, he pointed out. I had to ask what a rosary was at work, but she puts one around his neck and she says, and here Paul paused, trying to remember the exact words he'd read, "For your mother's sake." She says, "Your mother." I made some sound of agreement, letting him go on, not quite getting what his point was. He seemed to sense that. He reached out with his left hand to grip his old bicycle seat very tightly in a way that made it seem like he needed to release some tension. Some stranger from a country far away begs you to think of your mother, he said wonderingly. Wouldn't all that scare you so bad you'd go home? I tried to spin things a bit lighthearted. Well, if it was me we're talking about, I chuckled, I would have started crying when they suggested I leave my own neighborhood. But Paul was not amused. That's as far as I got so far, he said, subdued. Why would anyone write a book about that? About a man getting so scared? I asked him if he'd like to switch to something else, but he said no. He said that was too much to think about. He would keep going. I wished him good night and walked away. I turned around at one point to see him setting out on the bike toward Rodney Road, which meant a shadowy, twisting, shoulderless ride of at least 3 miles before he reached anywhere that might conceivably be his home. I liked to give my students one full class session to read through their books and work on their reports, knowing they were working people with busy schedules. I sat in a corner on Thursday night watching Daniela Tuve silently mouth passages in Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, and A.J. Lutz, who spent 3 days each week in a minimum security prison serving a sentence for auto theft, read Roald Dahl's The Witches, slumped cross-legged at his desk with an amused expression on his face, like he'd be happy to sit there for hours. Sometimes a hand would raise, and I'd offer clarification on some vocabulary. Paul McCooney moved very slowly through more pages of Dracula. Once or twice he lifted his chin to look around the room, eyes settling on me briefly. I nodded encouragingly, but he had no reaction. He was one of the last to gather his things and start heading for the door when our 75 minutes together ended. I went over to him and asked him how things were going. He was still visibly bothered by what he was reading, though the position of his New England Patriots bookmark hinted he hadn't made much progress. I was reading this part, he said, scratching his hair and looking into some middle space, where Harker's in that carriage and people all around him are talking in some weird language with words he has to look up. And when he does, they're all ghosty and monster things. Yeah, I replied, way out of his element. He asked me what I meant by that element. I did the best I could explaining the word. Then he lifted the book and opened it to a passage he'd underlined with a cheap blue ballpoint pen that left lumpy smudges on the page. Look here, he said to me, and scanned the key passage. They're crossing themselves, and they point 2 fingers at him to keep an evil eye away. I don't know what that is. And then he lowered the book and similarly pointed 2 fingers right at me, forming them into a sharp V. He held them there, aloft, for several seconds. When paired with his cold stare, the gesture unsettled me. I mumbled something about the superstitions of the world and my very loose understanding of the evil eye, but none of it seemed to register with him. He lowered his hand very slowly. And anytime someone talks about Count Dracula, they're always scared, too. He's the last person I'd ever want to be, trapped like that, he said about Jonathan Harker, and fell quiet, looking at the floor as if searching for answers there. Not knowing quite what to say, I asked him if the language was slowing him down, or, again, if the content was a bit rougher than he'd like. Copies of The Giver and The House on Mango Street were still unclaimed, along with a dozen others. I can't just close the book and he's still trapped there, he said, with total conviction. The words are all right. I just don't like... And here he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He struggled to zip up his weathered, overstuffed backpack that must have weighed 25 pounds. I glimpsed various random personal items in there, things suggesting a man who was always in transit. He was wearing his gray work vest, and I noticed there was a small tear on one shoulder and some kind of purplish goo streak clinging to one elbow. I asked him to just let me know how things went. I thought about asking him how he was going to spend the weekend, but held off. I was feeling more and more uncomfortable around Paul. When we got out to the hallway, a 19-year-old high school dropout named Madonna by her 80s-obsessed parents had some questions for me about Rumblefish, and Paul drifted off into the night. At home, sometime around 11, I pulled down from the shelf the original, unabridged, Signet Classic copy of Dracula I'd bought at age 14 with the money I'd made one Saturday babysitting my aunt's grumpy Pekingese. I got into bed beside my sleeping wife, flipped it open to the first page, and began to read, intending only to scan the parts Paul had gotten through. I realized that, given his reading level, he should have been much farther along by now, and the troubling thought occurred to me that he might be rereading passages again and again, but maybe not for comprehension's sake. It was possible, I supposed, that he'd gotten stuck somehow in these pages, so deeply uneasy and so faultily empathetic toward Jonathan Harker that he was afraid for the story to go on. The oppressive atmosphere Paul had been trying to express to me was certainly there on the page, though Jonathan Harker's surroundings couldn't have been as well described in the Essentials edition. For a man to be so far from home, all alone, surrounded by people who seemed to be terrified for him but would not or could not express why, must have been stressful and frightening indeed, day after day. The sense of getting farther and farther away from the familiar, of knowing there were days and days more to come, and then the landscape itself becoming an ominous intimidation. I thought of Paul alone somewhere in a small room, reading the sentences describing the carriage carrying Harker along uncomfortably and claustrophobically as he crossed into the Carpathian Mountains. However they may have been edited down, it gave me a bit of a shiver. Sometimes, as the road was cut through the pine woods that seemed in the darkness to be closing down upon us, great masses of grayness, which here and there bestrewed the trees, produced a peculiarly weird and solemn effect, which carried on the thoughts and grim fancies engendered earlier in the evening, when the falling sunset threw into strange relief the ghost-like clouds which amongst the Carpathians seemed to wind ceaselessly through the valleys. I'm sure this next one was not in Paul's book. It's one I didn't remember at all. Here and there was a peasant man or woman kneeling before a shrine, who did not even turn round as we approached, but seemed in the self-surrender of devotion to have neither eyes nor ears for the outer world. Oh God, I thought, he's about to read this part, and imagined the jagged peaks of the snow-capped mountains rising up on all sides of that carriage in the dark. Drifting off to sleep, I tried to piece together my random images and impressions of Paul McCooney, as I'd absorbed them since he first showed up at Stepping Stones of Reading 1 5 months ago, into a coherent whole. The wild tufts of hair around the ears, the rumpled clothing, the lack of mirth when others in the class laughed at one of my terrible dad jokes or said something funny themselves. A man clearly uncomfortable among people. A man whose past, under the weight of illiteracy and poverty, was a total mystery to me, and one I'd likely have struggled to understand. A traveler in a world he perceived very differently from people like me. Paul was noticeably absent from next Tuesday's class. As far as I could remember, he'd never missed a session, not one time. He needed to read better so he could do better at work, he'd reluctantly told the class by way of introduction long ago, and he seemed to take the responsibility of his attendance very seriously. After class, I had some administrative work to do on my laptop and decided to knock it out on a stone table outside the building while waiting for my wife to pick me up and drive us beyond the suburbs to see her mother in the hospital. The campus was mostly deserted, and it was nice to sit in the warm spring breeze just after sunset, lit mostly by the silent glow of the screen. There was an unusual email in my inbox. The username seemed to have been randomly generated because it was just the word user with 6 numbers after it, and I recognized the domain suffix as an email service I thought went extinct some time ago. There was no subject line. When I clicked on the message, expecting it to be either from a student or spam, this is what I read, with all the letters being block capitals, spilling out in a single, unbroken paragraph with several misspellings. Mr. Callio, you gave me a nasty book. Jonathan Harker tried to get out of the carriage on the Borgo Pass because he got so scared with all the animals screaming in the woods, but the driver said, no, you must not walk here. The dogs are too fierce, and you may have enough of such matters before you go to sleep. But he did not even explain what he meant. No one did, and so Jonathan is always so scared. The book says the crazy coach rocked and swayed like a boat on a stormy sea. Then at night the horses started to cry and shake, and they started to act like they wanted to run away. A secret carriage came up that I think they wanted to get away from, and Jonathan had to get out in the cold and go into the other one. There were no people inside it. He did not have a choice. So now he is totally alone, except for a new driver. Maybe a bad man. One of the gypsy people saw this man and said, "For the dead travel fast." I don't even know what that can mean. There is no safe place anywhere Jonathan goes to. You put this book out in class for anyone to pick up. That is bad, bad, bad. This book is meaning to make me feel scared, and you must have known that would happen. Why don't you feel emotions for Jonathan Harker, and why don't you hope that he is going to be okay? This is not why people should write books. Making people afraid to read is mean. Making people sick with worried is mean. I have had mean people in my life since I was real young. No more. I was flabbergasted and closed the laptop, wanting very much for my wife to arrive fast and take me away from there. I dreaded opening the email again at home 2.5 hours later, and had tried to mentally compose a response even as I exchanged empty words with my wife's ailing mother in her hospital room. I told Jackie I'd be late getting into bed, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, typing. Hello, Paul. We missed you in class tonight. I'm very sorry you don't like the book. Let's try something else. You can even have extra time to read a new one and finish the essay work. I did not realize you do not like what horror fiction tries to do, but I should not have assumed you would. Your email was very well written, and you are progressing well with your reading study. Hope to see you Thursday. The last thought I remember having that night as I tried to fall asleep was, he doesn't realize the final coach driver is Dracula. There was no response to what I sent him, and Paul failed to show up for the next class session, too. I received no word that he had officially dropped out of it. On my afternoon off, the day after that, I did a little GPS research on my phone and drove a few miles with a soothing takeout hot chocolate toward the more rural part of town, windshield wipers clawing against a steady rain. Situated in the middle of an empty plain was a massive L-shaped structure that resembled a wildly overgrown tin shed. The huge acreage surrounding it was fenced in. It was a cracker factory operating under the name Starland Gourmet. Paul had mentioned it exactly once, when I'd asked him some time ago how long it took him to get to class after his shift was over. I hadn't remembered the name of the company, but the logo was stitched very small into the shoulder of his work shirt. He worked in the box plant, I think, something like that. I wouldn't go onto the property, would not present myself at some front desk if one could even be found among all those closed doors running the length and width of the building. I wouldn't be that intrusive. How would I even justify that level of aggressive concern? I just found it easier to think and center my thoughts while idling on the shoulder, looking at the building. As I did so, those thoughts were invaded by a strange, unbidden image. I imagined myself briefly in the persona of Jonathan Harker. I pictured myself waking up just before dawn in a tiny room in a chilly inn, so far away from my home that the miles could not even be reliably calculated. I have no way of immediately contacting my wife, even just to tell her I'm okay and I miss her. I would have to rely on a foreign post, maybe handing a letter to the innkeeper and hoping for the best. I look through the darkness of the room to the window, wondering how close I am to seeing daylight. This is the day I know I'm headed into the Carpathians. I saw and felt the hills rising the entire day before as the carriage rattled onwards. My back and neck ache now because of all that jarring motion. No one knows where I am. No one speaks my language. I only know that everything seems wrong. Everything seems threatening. But I have a responsibility here, and I must go on. I must. I reach for my journal and light a candle, reading what I wrote before I went to bed. For Mina's sake, I then begin to strike out many lines, leaving only the ones most necessary to tell her the story. My true growing panic is edited out. If I come to real danger out here, I don't want her to ever find this journal and remember me being so shaken, so small. After 10 minutes of idling on the shoulder of the road where the cracker factory was, a loud truck rumbled past, uncomfortably close over my left shoulder, and I realized it wasn't even safe to be there. I pulled back onto the road and drove away. On the night of the third consecutive class session with no Paul McCooney, I became very depressed, realizing that he was never coming back. I'd felt that low once before with a student named Juan, whose struggles with basic reading skills had grown into an angry resentment of everyone who kept encouraging him. The rewards of the job were many, and I knew I'd get over it, but I didn't even feel like moving from behind the teacher's desk when the students left the room that night. I turned out the lights instead and closed my eyes in the linoleum silence, trying to reach a level of harmless, dead mental blankness before I walked home. I tried to think about how nice it would be to spend that Saturday working on the lawn and listening to the new Philippa Gregory book. My cell phone rang, breaking me out of my funk. Knowing it would be Jackie reminding me to thaw the chicken for our late dinner, I didn't even check my screen for an ID. Instead, I heard Paul McCooney's voice on the other end of the line. "Mr. Callio?" Jolted, I stood up from the chair and walked to the classroom door as I answered, feeling the sudden anxious need to be moving. I expressed awkward pleasure in hearing from him, assuming he'd kept my number from when I'd offered it freely to the students, who had the grace to almost never use it. "I'm mad," Paul said softly. "I'm mad at your book." Bram Stoker's book, remember, I corrected him gently. I was standing now in the dark hallway. Only a single classroom was lit on its far end, near the east exit, but it was empty. "He hears actual big wolves out there," Paul informed me. "The carriage keeps going, and the more it goes, the nearer they get. He can sense it. What do you think that would feel like? To hear wolves in the woods that are all around you?" "Paul," I said, "it's a horror story. I know that can be upsetting if you don't have any experience with something like that. I guess you don't, but it's not real. There's no danger. It's all from the imagination of someone." "But you could have stopped it," Paul said with a truly blunt edge. "You could have not put it out for me." I walked slowly down the hallway, at a loss for a response. I meant to leave the building and get out into the open air, though that side of the building was not very well lit. Anything was better than being alone with Paul's voice in that confined, dark space. His heavy exhalations would occasionally distort the phone speaker in scratchy bursts. "Where are you, Paul?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "The class misses you." "You know the blue fire?" he asked me. For a second I thought he must have misspoken. The reference made no sense to me. "The coach driver gets out," Paul told me. "He goes into the trees. He leaves Jonathan all alone. There's a blue fire." I did remember then. I'd always wondered what that blue flame truly was, what it meant, but had never gotten around to looking it up. Harker spotted it in the woods, mystified, mesmerized by its glow. Referring to the cruel coachman who'd climbed out of the carriage to enter the woods, the text read, "Gathering a few stones, he formed them into some sort of device." But there's little more description than that, even in the unabridged version. "Jonathan can see the fire right through the driver," Paul recounted. "Like the driver's not normal, like he's a ghost or something. Then he comes back. The horses start to act really crazy. They're trying to get away." I asked Paul, pleaded with him, really, to stop reading the book for his own sake, and assured him there was a happy ending for Jonathan, of a kind. There really was. He needn't worry so much. He replied coldly, "There can't be. For his body maybe, but not his mind. Not after something like that happened to him. I know what bad things do." I pushed on the iron bar that opened to the hallway's exit door, and it released me into the cool night. I let him go on. "Then the wolves come out," he said, and they're all around him. Jonathan's trapped in the carriage. Wolf eyes. It's dark. They want to kill something. I knelt over and put my hands on my knees, trying to breathe in and out very evenly, feeling as if I'd been punched in the stomach. "Someone needs to scare you permanent," Paul said finally, and hung up on me. I tried to call him back. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. I considered texting, but thought it might be better to withdraw completely from this madness. I stood uselessly looking off at the campus police hut across the quad, whose presence was suddenly comforting in a way it never had been. I aimed myself in the direction of home and began to walk. 15 minutes and I'd be there. I found myself turning on the sidewalk and looking back past the sporadic lampposts into the dark, hoping I wouldn't see someone there. Just a block shy of the north edge of my neighborhood, I cut to my left off the sidewalk, waded through a harmless patch of scrub, and stepped over a low wooden border fence. Over it sprawled a rolling open field connected to Frontier's stables, a vast patch of land the college had tried to acquire a couple of times. I stood on the field's edge and looked up at the full moon. The trees, forming a thick, long row in the distance, rustled in secret conversation. I imagined myself stepping out of a cramped carriage and seeing a ring of wolves beside those trees, eyes glittering in the dark. And my only protector was someone who had begun to terrify me. I walked along the field's edge for a time, illegally, I supposed, then took a leafy cut-through back to the road. I was soon on familiar and well-lit ground. I made it home fine. I shut my phone off and reminded myself to count my blessings more often. In particular, the seemingly simple gift of awareness of what could truly hurt me and what could not. Stepping stones of reading 1 and 2 ended shortly after that night. Everyone in both tiers ended with successful marks, save for 2 dropouts. A sheet metal worker whose scheduling conflicts made him have to try again in summer, and Paul McCooney. A local used bookstore brought in 2 carts of paperbacks, so every student could take home a few things, no charge. It was always my favorite moment of the whole teaching process, seeing people flipping through something off the cart, considering carefully what to take. People like car thief A.J. Lutz, choosing a graphic novel adaptation of White Fang, or a woman from a year before, Margaret Tall, whose sight had been restored surgically well enough after 30 years of legal blindness to finally read words on a page, taking Confessions of a Shopaholic. I tell people a moment like that is worth not just all the stress of teaching, but all the stress of living. In a week and a half, I'd resume my usual daytime teaching schedule for a little while, advanced composition and modern American writers. Because of the little shelf shopping ritual, the students filed out for good 15 minutes later than normal. And before I headed home, I sat down to do 30 minutes of end-of-spring session wrap-up work, vexing administrative stuff I was late sending off to the department head. That, again, left me self-consciously alone on the bottom floor, the other classes having discharged everyone already. I closed my laptop at about 10 after 9. A takeout Detroit-style pizza was waiting for me at home, and I headed for the hallway. I hated that the lights got turned off so early, leaving them on a motion sensor that only activated when someone's path broached either end of the hall. I think now of how my sight line swept so briefly across the classroom door across from mine, as it naturally did whenever I passed, and how some part of me did register the slightest anomaly there, which was that the door of that long unused room was partly open. It meant nothing to me in the moment. I'd only gotten 8 or 10 steps toward the building's exit when I heard running steps behind me, slapping on the floor in a weirdly exaggerated cadence and a different pitch than shoes normally do. I turned immediately, my senses on high alarm, but the body coming at me hit me so fast I had no time to even raise my arms in self-defense. I saw only a colorless human shape close in, out of focus, and heard a shrill voice emit a sharp grunt a split second before the shape collided with me. I was thrown backward and down, my breath knocked out of me, my right hip taking the entire brunt of the contact with the floor, getting badly bruised. My laptop case went flying, and I cried out in terror. A body landed on top of mine, tumbled off to one side from the jolt of hard impact, but then scrambled back to pin me down before I could regain myself. The man elevated himself on his forearms in a push-up position. He stared down at me, his face 12 inches above mine. But it was unrecognizable. "Did I scare you?" he cried, spit leaping from his lips. "Did I scare you? Did I scare you?" I struggled to escape, but he was quick to seize my wrists and slam them back onto the floor. He could have killed me then. But instead, he shifted his weight and climbed back onto his feet, leaving me stunned and prepared to beg for mercy. He balanced himself fast and loomed above me in the shadows. Paul McCooney had wrapped what looked like thick white string tightly around and around his face in a chaotic pattern that constricted and distorted his features from chin to forehead. Through that weave, I could see that dark, clumsy makeup rings encircled his eyes, making them seem as if they peered out from deep pits. On his head, Paul wore a sort of black fedora with a brim so wide it looked medieval somehow. His torso was hidden inside a thick cloak that came down past his knees, and he'd adhered long, curling artificial fingernails to each hand, tapered to menacing spurs. "You're so lucky you made it to the castle okay," Paul said, the words deformed and hard to discern because the taut string blocked his lips from fully connecting. "I broke your evil book. Be glad I didn't drag you into the woods and give you to wolves." And then I saw it, saw what he'd been trying to do with his muddle of a costume, this collection of mismatched garb, because he'd added something jarringly amateurish to it all, which was a pair of gray, rubbery webbed feet that might belong to some swamp creature. Paul had put on his body anything and everything he could that he found sinister and blood-curdling, without considering the broken logic of his appearance, or how vastly different it all was from the primal fears Jonathan Harker must have suffered. This was horror as Paul understood it. He hadn't anticipated the rather sad effect his appearance might have had on me in that moment if I'd been thinking straight. It was only after that night, remembering it all, that the image haunted me in a way he didn't foresee. He left me there on the floor, never to return to my life. I had the fortitude somehow, after he pushed his way out the exit door at the far end of the hallway under a harsh splash of sensor-triggered fluorescent light, to walk in the direction he'd emerged from. In the minutes before his attack, he must have been hiding in the classroom across the hall from mine. Who knows how long he'd been in there, sitting in the dark, waiting for class to end. Atop a student desk inside that room, he had abandoned his Essentials for Learning publications copy of Dracula. Some of it was missing, though. Everything before Jonathan Harker's safe arrival at the door of the Count's castle had been torn away by hand, leaving behind the vast bulk of the book. I think it was Paul's statement to me that he had no intention of reading the rest of the story. I think he had stopped right where he wanted and needed to, where he could at last, after so many nights of terror and tragic empathy, exhale and believe that Jonathan was going to be all right as he stepped inside his host's residence. All the horrors that came after that castle door opened to him, the ones known to generations of readers and moviegoers, will likely spare my former student forever.